Thank you very much, and thanks to both academies for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to be here already, and I want to present the paper for Partha and me, and we want to dedicate it to a past member of the Academy, Ken Arrow, who was our close friend, and we miss a great deal, and we worked with him on a lot of the kind of issues that we discuss in the paper. And I want to thank Partha and Peter for struggling with me over this and many other things. I do have to say that if there are any errors of fact in the things I say or any outrageous statements, they're entirely the responsibility of Professor Dasgupta. There's no question at all that we're undergoing a vast extinction event. There's also no question that it's caused essentially entirely by human activities. And the first reason that we value biodiversity is what it does for the very species that is causing the extinction event. So a little bit of irony in there. A lot of the work has been done by people in this room, particularly Gretchen Daly, on the issue of the ecosystem services that are supplied to us by biodiversity or by, as we often discuss, natural capital, which is one of the big elements biodiversity is one of the big elements in natural capital. And the things that biodiversity supplies us are very, very diverse. Deeply involved in supplying us with water, fresh water, deeply involved in controlling the gaseous quality of the atmosphere, which in turn controls our climate, deeply involved in supplying both food from the sea, as well as, in many cases, meat from the land, as well as crops, maintaining the quality of soil, which is absolutely essential to agriculture, controlling floods, controlling erosion, pollinating crops, which, as I mentioned before, although our main feeding base is maize and wheat and rice, a lot of the essential micronutrients, I'm setting the bezel on my watch because I'm not supposed to go over 2 hours. Many of the plants that supply us with critical micronutrients are insect pollinated, for example, or bat pollinated, or what have you. Many people do not realize that we could not run our high intensity agricultural system without the natural controls on pests. Bats and birds and many insects control the pests that attack our crops. We can't control them with pesticides to the level we would like to, for reasons I could go into, but I won't. They also protect us from other vectors of disease. The list is very, very long, and what it boils down to is when we are killing off biodiversity, we're sawing off the limb that we're sitting on. Intensely stupid, no question about it, and hardly paid any attention to. Now, that's one set of reasons. We may call those the ecosystem service or the natural service reasons that we want to preserve biodiversity. But for me, and I think most of my colleagues, unfortunately not for everybody, there's also a large ethical reason for preserving biodiversity. I didn't mention the spiritual and aesthetic services we get, but even beyond them, a lot of us feel that we have an ethical duty to protect the only other life forms we know that we share the universe with. If you are interested in that side of it, I could highly recommend to you a book by Carl Safina called Beyond Words, which will give you insights into the thoughts and feelings of other organisms derived from science. For instance, for me, I'm a carnivore, but it's led me to think very hard about whether I still want to eat meat. Carl Safina, Beyond Words. So, very, very important, and I'm pleased to say that one of the best statements on the ethical issues came from Pope Francis. If I can quote from Laudato Si, it's probably I mispronounced it. Each year sees the disappearance of thousands of plant and animal species which we will never know, which our children will never see, because they have been lost forever. The great majority become extinct for reasons related to human activity. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right, and I would say, amen. Stuart has gone over very nicely the issues of species loss, how many they are, and their disappearance. I think that what we don't emphasize enough is the critical issue of the loss of populations. For one thing, as Stuart indicated, the loss of species is, in terms of a human lifespan, quite slow. Average year, say, 2 disappear. It's a small bat from a tropical island and a mammal of some sort that lives in a desert. People don't notice it. That's a general problem we have in the environmental area that's not very recognized and traces to our evolution. For most of human history, the important thing was to detect things that are going on fast. That is, if you're walking through the forest and a leopard jumps at you, you want to react like instantaneously. And our perceptive systems evolved not just to let you detect rapid change, but also to keep the environmental background stationary so that you can detect the change better. This is something, for example, that you can all test for yourself. If I move my head like this, my head moves, but all you stay still. If you take out your iPhone and do that with the iPhone while it's on video, you'll get nauseated. Everything goes like that. But because your proprioceptors tell you your head is moving, your brain adjusts and keeps the background steady. The horrible thing is the most threatening things, the things that are now threatening to end civilization in the environment, are things that are going on in the background that we keep steady. That is, I can remember, I'm old enough to remember right after the first A-bombs went off, being incredibly nervous about atomic bombs. Now we have so many of them, so many nuclear weapons of one sort or another trained, the Russians at us at the Russians, and lots of other people with them, that we don't worry about them. The buildup was slow. The climate is changing, but it's not changing that fast in the view of the average person. In Australopithecus, if the climate started to change on Australopithecus, it wasn't causing the change, and there wasn't a damn thing it could do about it either. I mean, all it could mutate or migrate. That was about the limits, and it didn't do anything. So we are in a situation where we are designed not to see the things that are threatening us most. And species extinction is in that league. Fortunately or unfortunately, population extinction is different. Species extinction going on maybe 1,000 times the background rate historically, but population extinction is going on millions of times that rate. One of the recent estimates was that we have lost in the last 40 years about half of the wildlife on the planet. That isn't half the wildlife species, but half of the species, populations, individuals, and genetic diversity that was present. I have a paper with several colleagues in review in Science Advances at the moment where we look at what's happening to population extinctions. And what you can see is populations are disappearing everywhere. That this looks mostly at vertebrates and in detail at mammals, but if you map them, you can see, for example, the lion, which once was a swath of populations that went from the Gir forest in India, that area, all the way across southern Europe, northern Africa, all the way down Africa, basically solid lion. And now, of course, the map is mostly holes. There are spots in Africa where there are lions. There's still a few in the Gir forest. Between the two, there are basically none. One estimate is that we have already wiped out more than 99% of the elephants that were once on the planet. And of course, we got the mammoths before that and the mastodons before that. So wiping out the population diversity we have is going on very fast. It is a predecessor to the loss of species, and in one way the loss of species is more serious because that's irreversible. So if we ever have a chance to come back, we need the species to, if we want to repopulate in something less than the 10 million years that otherwise we might have to wait, which maybe even this building wouldn't last the full 10 million. But the other side of the coin is it's the populations that provide us with the ecosystem services that are critical. For example, if we wiped out all the honeybees just in North America, people estimate, and it's a very, very rough estimate, that it would cost us something like $18 billion a year. But of course, we wouldn't have lost the species. In fact, if we lost all the honeybees in the world except one population in Italy, and Italy is the Italian bee that we moved to North America, although it's basically an African and Southern Asian species, we could lose all those populations, lose all those pollination services, and yet the species list wouldn't lose one. So you can think of it as really a bifid problem. That is, there's a huge problem of species extinction, which is incredibly fast in geological terms, but slow in our perceptive terms. On the other hand, people are perceiving right now, people who have any interest in nature, the loss of populations. People are talking about the songbirds disappearing. The fisheries story is they're coming back, but notice we're noting what's happening with the populations. The issue of what's going on in the oceans has not been one primarily of species extinction, it's been of population extinctions. The great whales, for example, some of the populations have gone extinct, many of them have declined. I don't think we've lost a single whale species. A couple of dolphins have gone, the vaquita and something else. Anyway, the basic point is the population extinctions are something that people can have their attention called to, and I think that's an important thing. So the extinction process is going on, and we know what's causing it. There isn't any mystery at all. It's tied to what I said earlier, that habitats are disappearing. You don't have to have a count of species to see that the stuff is gone from your backyard, your local park, or wherever. If any of you, for instance, have been to Kenya over the last 30 or 40 years, used to be right in Nairobi. You could go out to Nairobi National Park and see an incredible array of the large mammal fauna of Africa right in Nairobi National Park. I haven't been there recently, but I'm told that it's down to a very few species, and that's happening basically everywhere. We are wiping out the life of this planet, which we are dependent upon, A, and B, we, I believe, have an ethical responsibility to. Now, the main sources of extinction are, first of all, habitat destruction, and that's one of the reasons that we know there's an extinction crisis. You don't have to, could somebody grab me a glass of water? I'm sorry. I keep forgetting I don't have any voice left. One of the reasons we know we're in an extinction crisis is we know that organisms are utterly dependent on their habitats. And so if you're paving over the earth, if you're changing huge areas into agriculture, if you're allowing heavy grazing on huge areas and so on, Oh, you're wonderful, thank you. You don't have to worry about whether or not you're facing extinction. So habitat outright destruction is big. Something that Stewart emphasized, which I think is very important and people don't realize, is when you take a forest and fraction it, you lose lots and lots of the things that are in it. You lose plants that are very susceptible to drying. You lose all the animals that are dependent on those plants. Drying goes in, for instance, from a road, drying goes in depending on various factors, but something on the order of 1 kilometer or more, the serious driving. So fractioning habitats is bad. Then we're soaking the entire planet in toxic chemicals. And putting toxic chemicals in an environment, even for Homo sapiens, is not a great idea. One of the predictions is that within the next, I believe it is 6 years, maybe 10, there'll be a bigger weight of plastics in the ocean than there will be of fishes. And worse than that, the plastics tend to accumulate persistent organic pollutants on their surface, and they're ground down to such small sizes that everybody gets them from the food chain, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier. So we've developed a little system for moving persistent organic pollutants into our brains. Not a clever move, actually, and nothing, as far as I can see, is being done about it. Moving organisms around the planet, again, is causing loss of biodiversity. One of the main reasons, as far as I can tell, and I don't know if maybe somebody here knows more about it, that we're losing amphibians about as fast as anything goes, is a fungus that's traveling around. We are losing bats in North America with a fungus they now think was brought by spelunkers, people who love to travel in caves, brought it in from Europe. The European bats were used to it, and the North American bats were not used to it and are dying from it. It's sort of like what happened to the indigenous people of the Americas when the conquistadors came in. The conquistadors themselves would have easily been wiped out by the Native Americans. It was the bacteria and viruses that the conquistadors brought with them that basically wiped out the people of the Western Hemisphere. The estimates go way up, but most people think more than 90% of the people living in the Western Hemisphere with some civilizations that were much more advanced than the ones in the old world were taken out. You move things around, you disrupt things, you change habitats. If your habitat contains smallpox, you're in a very different situation than if it doesn't, and so on. So the causes of extinction are clear. I always insist on bringing up a potential cause of extinction that is not getting enough attention right now. In fact, when the Trump administration came in, Environmental Health Sciences asked me to write an article about what we should be doing. And the first thing I said was not stopping extinctions, for instance. It was to get something done about the nuclear weapons situation. Because if we continue, the U.S. this is a place where the U.S. has been particularly bad, including Hillary Clinton, but although Trump has recently announced that we are going to build a lot more nuclear weapons so we can be top of the pack there. I have to tell you that John Holdren and John is Anna, my closest friend probably, John and Sherry. He was Obama's science advisor. About 50 years ago when we were drunk and were doing some calculations on nuclear weapons, we decided it would take to wipe out the United States as a functional entity about 12 Hiroshima-sized bombs, and to get rid of Russia it would only take 10 or 11. Because all you have to do, you see, besides knocking out the electric grid, is hit the main transport centers, and then everybody starves to death. And it turned out that Russia's system had fewer nodes you had to hit than the US. And of course we got thousands pointed at them now, many of them in silos in North America particularly, where they're extremely dangerous, easily accidentally launched, and we've had many close calls. And if you think biodiversity is going to last into its present state, through a large-scale nuclear war or even a small one between India and Pakistan, for example, which has been studied, you're wrong. It's going to be a disaster not just for Homo sapiens, but for biodiversity. And in this case, of all the possible sources of collapse, a large-scale nuclear war is the one where it's hardest to see any kind of a recovery. That's just a commercial, but I and my friends and colleagues are so worried about this that we don't like to ever give a talk without pointing it out because it's ignored, at least in the US press, how dangerous it is, and doing more of it is even more dangerous. I have to say that on top of all this, we have been overusing the atmosphere as a sink for greenhouse gases. And there, I have to say, the person in the world who has done more to initiate work to get it changed has been Pope Francis. It's one of the biggest threats that humanity faces, and I think his coming out on it was maybe the most important single thing that anybody has done so far to move in the right direction on climate change. I have to say, sadly, that the America's new Secretary of State has probably done more on the other side than any human being, because he financed, when he was head of Exxon, he financed the entire program of lying about climate disruption that has been so successful in North America. So anyway, I had to throw in that little commercial because I think it is so incredibly important. About climate disruption, I'd only say one thing, and that is, I think, well, I should say, I'll say a couple of things. One is, other environmental problems are frighteningly bad, just like climate change. The toxification of the planet, the loss of biodiversity, which is tied to climate change, and so on, are also important, but not covered by the press, by the media in general. And people do not pay attention to the interactions among these factors, because, for instance, if you look at agriculture, the situation is kind of ironic. First of all, I think the most serious threat, and my colleagues agree, of climate disruption is disruption to the agricultural system and maybe to the marine system because of the food problems. Agriculture is utterly dependent on the climate, on the distribution of moisture and so on, which is one of the things that's changing right now. But agriculture, the food system itself, depending on how you do the numbers, is responsible for something on the order of 35% of the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. Now, by the way, I'm not knocking sea level rise. That could easily affect gradually. I think right here you're probably safe for a few years, but gradually it could affect hundreds of millions of people. But if you change the agricultural system, it's going to affect billions of people, and we're already seeing signs of that. Reduced productivity in standard crops in Asia and so on, tied to climate change. So climate change affects food. Food itself, of course, is putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and agriculture is probably the single biggest source of habitat destruction, which wipes out, of course, the biodiversity which agriculture is utterly dependent on. The soil organisms, for example, we don't know yet how bad that is, but it's been a really funny historical sequence. We invented the plow, and that greatly expanded the carrying capacity of the planet for human beings. But it also started really working on soil erosion and destruction of the soil, what's sometimes called the production biodiversity, the small organisms in the soil that fix nitrogen, that fix carbon, that recycle nutrients, and so on. And so we moved to using chemical means to not till the soil anymore with plows, and that has similar effects. And we solved the problem, we solved, in quotes, some of the problems of soil fertility with artificial fertilizers, with the Bosch process. And that tends to wipe out the biodiversity that's so critical. We don't know enough. Hopefully many of you are watching the literature. The more stuff we learn about microbiomes, and you're not being addressed by me, you're being addressed by a combination of a whole lot of mammal cells and a whole lot of bacterial cells. And it's not quite clear yet whether, from me, I hate to tell you what it depends on, so I won't, whether they're more bacterial cells or more Homo sapiens cells depends on how recently you ate and did other things. But the more we learn, the more it's clear that we've got to learn a lot more about microbiomes and try and answer questions like, what happens if you wipe out 5 populations of these microbes in this farming system, and so on. Very, very critical issues. Partha already mentioned some of the economic issues. One of the reasons I tend to be pessimistic about the state of the world is the growth mania that afflicts our society. I think every colleague that'll speak to me, and there's a few anyway, agrees that you can't grow forever on a finite planet, that the biggest problem we face is continual expansion of the human enterprise. I would love to see hundreds of trillions of human beings live over the next few million years rather than see if we can cram 11 billion in by 2110 and then let the whole thing go down the drain. The sustainability is talked about a lot, but a lot of people talk about things like sustainable growth. Perpetual growth is the creed of the cancer cell. And we really have to look at the size of the human enterprise and think about why we're doing these things. Why would we, knowing perfectly well, and I shouldn't say, obviously not every individual knows it, but our society knows soil erosion is bad. Society knows that you have to have some kind of a farming system that can be perpetuated and so on. Why are we wiping out of biodiversity when everybody knows pollinators are critical to us? And the answer, of course, is not just greed and stupidity. It's that a lot of the things we depend on, as Partha mentioned, are parts of our natural capital that are not priced. And so individuals can get huge benefits without paying the social costs of what they're doing. In other words, I fly around a lot and I put a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but I'm not paying a direct price for them. The pricing system does not allow us to really properly consider, the way we run it at least, the externalities. That is, the things, externalities, of course, are things involved in transactions where the money isn't passing to those people. That is, if you paint your house, you add to the value of your neighbor's houses. If you let your lawn grow too high, you subtract from the value of your neighbor's houses, and you don't pay those prices. And we all put those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and when you get a drought in Africa because of it, the poor Africans are not paying for it. And I should say, I want to be very clear on one point. I want to be very clear on every point, but I won't be. But actually, there's this terrible feeling in the United States and many places that the problems of the world are the poor people. It's those poor Africans that breed too much. They kill the bush meat, on and on. It's somebody else. The big population and the big problems of the combination of population and per capita consumption. It's the aggregate consumption that ruins the environment. Of course, it's the United States, Sweden, Switzerland, Italy, all those wonderful places that have gotten the poor countries to pay the price. So if you think about what we have to do, among other things, we have to make sure that we get some equity in the world, that poor people get taken care of. You think of poor people living in the slums of India or the slums of Africa. I live in one of the richest towns in the world, Palo Alto, California, and I carry bills in my pocket because there are people begging on the streets there. And somebody said it here, I think, already, but if you can't even, I think maybe it was Peter, if you can't take care of the people in your own society, when you live in a rich society, and so on. It tells us we really need very fundamental changes in our attitudes, our ethics, our morals, how we run the world. I'll finish by mentioning something that's not cheery at all, with a whole bunch of colleagues, including people at Cambridge and the Center for Existential Risk. A lot of us have been looking at the issue of how do we soften the collapse. I'm convinced, and some of my colleagues are too, we're already in a societal collapse. If you look at Joe Tainter's work and so on, the prediction for what indicates a collapse is starting is when you get a diminishing returns to complexity, marginal returns to complexity, so that when you look at the energy in versus the energy out, the EROI statistics, 1900, you drilled a well in Texas and you got a gusher. And it took 1 unit of energy to drill the well, and you got 100 units out. And now you go to the tar sands in Canada, and you get 4 units out for every unit you put in. In other words, it's 25 times worse than it was before, and this goes across the whole society. Anyway, we are looking at issues of how you soften the collapse, and the really tricky part, and the part where I think it ties to the stories we ought to tell and what we ought to be thinking about and the things we ought to tell the kids, is not just how you soften the collapse, and we hope by discussing that we might even avoid the full collapse, but what do you do afterwards? I hate to hear the term, we restore or we rebuild. If you rebuild the kind of system we have today, all you're doing is guaranteeing another collapse. In other words, the issue is, and I think for all of us, and particularly for people at a meeting like this, to think about how do you design a world that is actually sustainable and has insurance built into it, and sees to it that everybody is treated as properly as they possibly can be treated. And I think that's a challenge for the kids. I'd like to see everybody working on it starting in junior high school. How would you design, for instance, a money system for economics classes? As you all know, fractional reserve banking is how you generate your money, and it absolutely requires growth. So how do you build a system that doesn't have to grow forever? And I guess what I'll do is thank you for your attention and leave you with that challenge. Thanks.